you only have 7 days to live if you don't try out one of the most unique control decks Standard has to offer right now. Find out what's so cursed coming up right now. You asked, so I'm delivering. Jacob O. Eisler had asked for the best performing control archetype at Worlds to get a full-fledged deck tech, and according to the win rates I've gathered after separating out these distinct archetypes from one another, that means we're going to be looking at Chris Botello's unique take on Jeskai control. Jeskai recording control. Now, when it comes to a Botello brew, we're for sure going to be getting some interesting cards that we might not usually see floating around. After all, the pilot is the originator of the Cat Donate deck from Standard's past, giving away Demonic Pact to opposing players so they could lose the game instead. You know, Chris, Pact is legal in Standard now. We've got another 4 years of foundations to make it work now. But until we see a Pact deck from them, we're going to be going over the different cards in the main deck and sideboard of this Jeskai recording list and how they function within the confines of said list. Then look at some potential other cards that are floating around other versions of control decks and how they may work, although this list is quite unique, so there won't be a ton of that. And then, of course, we're going to wrap it up with the best case scenarios for the deck, its common play patterns, and where the deck excels and where it struggles in its head-to-head matchups. So for starters, let's talk about the one of most unique card in the deck that really makes the list hum when it hits the battlefield. Cursed Recording. Now, fans of Pyromancer's Goggles list back in Old Standard may have seen this card and thought similar of it, and Chris B has found a way to make it work in a control list instead of a ramp shell this time. This 2 and 2 red artifact says that whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a time counter on Cursed Recording. Then, if there are 7 or more time counters on it, remove those counters and it deals 20 damage to you. Surprise! After 7 days, Sadako leaps out of the tape and finishes you off. A nice flavor win from Duskmorn. But if that's all the card did, it would be terrible. So it does have some more text. Now, if you tap Cursed Recording, you can cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, you copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. So this is where the Pyromancer's Goggles part of the card comes into play, where you can essentially get double casts of spells from your deck so long as you aren't casting a ton of spells every turn and lose the game by taking 20. Now, this worked quite well within a control shell, since you'll ideally be playing something like a draw-go plan of Magic, where you draw your card for the turn and then pass to your opponent, waiting to respond to their plays with the card you have in hand. Now, when you do have a spell you wish to copy, you can tap the recording to do so, but remember it has to be done before you cast the spell, so you can't copy things that are already on the stack. We'll go over the spells we have to copy in the list in a little bit, and trust me, there are a lot of them. But I do want to touch upon why this deck has been sectioned off from the other Jeskai control lists, especially if the Namesake card is only a one of. As we go through the list, we'll see how the majority spells of the deck, as well as the absence of cards like Shiko, Paragon of the Way from the deck, shift the list into something with more expensive shells that Shiko decks usually don't run because they don't get to get played with their Namesake card. This effectively changes how the deck plays, even if a bunch of the cards are going to have overlap. It does mean that the deck is lacking crucial to the board play that can make aggro-centric matchups play out vastly different ways compared to the Shiko deck, especially when it comes to how you have to approach the matchup in general. But enough about that, let's get to the juicy bits. The main spell we want to cast with Cursed Recording is one of the biggest and best ways we have to win the game with the deck, Jeskai Revelation. This super powerful 7 mana instant does a little bit of everything, which makes it a powerful game-changing card to play. You get to return target spell or permanent to its owner's hand, it deals 4 damage to any target, you make 2 1/1 monk tokens with prowess, Corey Steel Cutter style, you draw 2 cards, and you gain 4 life. So besides the fact that the first Jeskai Revelation is often game-changing, imagine doubling all of that thanks to Cursed Recording. Suddenly, you're bouncing or soft countering 2 things, making 4 tokens, gaining 8 life, drawing 4 cards, and dealing up to 8 damage to 1 target, or 4 to 2 targets in one go. Jeskai Revelation not only helps to seal the deal on winning the game in this list, but it also makes sure that we don't lose the game ourselves, as the first part of the spell resolving can target our own permanents as well. This means that we can bounce our cursed recording if we feel like our time counter count is getting too high for our own comfort. Although resolving a copied Jeskai revelation is pretty much lights out, so long as you've got some time counters to spare. 4 monks with prowess can end the game across 1 or 2 turns in this list quite quickly. One other spell to mention wanting to copy, for a win anyway, is a classic from counter-burn style decks throughout the ages with, oh my god, Lightning Helix! Popping up yet again alongside its good friends Countermagic and Card Draw as a way to finish the game. The classic 2-mana Boros instant deals 3 damage to any target and gains you the same amount of life, the perfect duality of a Boros Burn Shell. Well, normally this is perfectly fine in other Jeskai lists, such as the Shiko control decks as the way to remove small creatures, then have it flash back with Shiko later to do the same, or get much needed damage to your opponent. But here, the card also gives the deck some pretty solid closing power. If you haven't done any other damage to your opponent, or their own shocking and starting towning, you can get a clean 18 damage out of your Lightning Helixes so long as they get copied with Cursed Recording. Now, of course, that's a bit of a Christmas miracle land as a play pattern, since we're most likely going to need these bad boys to take down some aggro threats in the early game. But even just being able to 2-for-1 an aggro board for 6 total damage and 6 life is a game-changing play to make in some matchups with that Cursed Recording in play. Although control decks are notoriously light on win conditions, in the current era of Standard with decks building up massive board states of otters and simic creatures aplenty, there have to be some concessions made to playing to the board. In more recent history, this is where Planeswalkers came in to fill the gap and provide multiple effects for control decks to play with. But with none of the current Jeskai flavor walkers having much of a quote-unquote control deck feel besides maybe Elspeth Stormslayer, we're seeing them go back to a time when control decks played creatures, or at least in this case, creatures with multiple effects for multiple use cases. That kind of sounds like Planeswalkers anyway. Well, we've got 2 of them, and you've heard of them before and seen them a bunch. Overlord of the Mistmoors and Meringue River Regent. Overlord comes down early for its impending cost of 2 and 2 white to make a pair of 2/1 flying blockers, while coming off cooldown a few turns later to do the same thing whenever it attacks, Titan style. And if the deck gets to a point where it's so far in control, you can always just hardcast it for 7 mana to get the big 6/6 body alongside a pair of insects. Meringue River Regent does help win games, but also provides an additional card draw spell aside from the spells that we'll go over in a little bit, thanks to its Omen side Coiling Catch. For 3 and a blue at instant speed, you can draw 3 and discard just 1 card, shuffling the threat back into your deck for later. On hardcast, you get to bounce 2 things from the battlefield back to their owner's hands, so you can bounce your opponent's board and then counter or kill it on recast, or you can bounce your own Cursed Recording to reset the counters before it pops on you. Aside from ways to outright win the game, there are plenty of spells in the deck that do some great work on their own, but really amp up the power when copied with Cursed Recording. Card Advantage has been a staple of control decks, and Consult the Star Charts is one of the best that we have right now. For just 2 mana at instant speed, you can look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of lands you control. Choose 1 and place it into your hand, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. However, if you pay its kicker cost for an additional 2 mana, you get to take 2 of the cards from the top X and put them into your hand instead. This spell follows in the footsteps of other great card advantage powerhouses such as Dig Through Time and Memory Deluge, looking for a broad swath of cards and then picking the cream of the crop for the situation you find yourself in. Looking at 4 and taking 2 is pretty good, but as the game goes on and you continue to make your land drops, these spell gets stronger and stronger. Assuming we played a kicked Consult the Star Charts the turn after landing a Cursed Recording, you're going to essentially be looking at the top 10 cards of your library and putting 4 of them into your hand. Talk about pretty powerful. Being able to do this at instant speed is what makes the card much stronger and versatile overall, since you can still play your draw-go type of game and hold up interaction, weighing your options before deciding on what to play, your own card advantage, looking for the answer that you need in order to stop what your opponent is doing, or use the resources you currently have in hand to put a stop to it. Of course, you can also use it in tandem with your interactive spells. Paying 2 mana to look at the top X cards, take 1 isn't awful at its own rate, especially if you do so to find a key counter or removal spell at the right time. Stock Up is the other card advantage card that usually competes with Consult the Star Charts, but Chris B opted to run both in this list. Everyone's favorite chase uncommon from Aether Drift, Stock Up is a 3-mana sorcery spell that looks at the top 5 cards of your library, where you choose 2 of them and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Now this is on par with the kicker cost of Consult the Star Charts with 5 lands in play. However, for 1 less mana, it has to be done at sorcery speed versus holding up the mana for an instant speed play. Now, normally a game-changing play in and of itself, with Cursed Recording, you again essentially get to look at the top 10 cards of your library and choose 4 of them. Now, the downside, aside from its sorcery speed restriction, is the fact that Stock Up is fully front-loaded. All of its power is on the card, and it doesn't scale with the game going longer like Consult the Star Charts does. Fire Magic is another spell that gets out of hand when being copied, as the Pyroclasm adjacent damage-based board wipe has 3 different modes you can choose from, dealing increasing amounts of damage if you pay more for it. 1 mana nets you 1 damage, 3 mana nets you 2 damage, and 6 mana nets you 3 damage to all creatures at instant speed. Normally a pretty pricey board wipe in the later game, and notably bad at dealing with Ouroboros, Preacher of the Schism, and other members of the 3+ toughness club in the early game, Cursed Recording changes that equation. Now for 3 mana, we can get a total of 4 damage to be done to the board, we're going positive here, wiping out a lot of key cards from the creature-based decks in the format, while having at minimum 2 extra mana on curve, assuming you hit your land drops. Now, Fire Magic is also quite potent against the plethora of X1 creatures, from Otter tokens to Demir's main Kaito tools, giving the card a solid spot in the main deck. Get Lost is the main non-damage removal spell of the deck, as the quote-unquote white Doomblade takes care of all sorts of creatures, enchantments, and planeswalkers, while leaving behind 2 map tokens for the controller of whatever it destroys. Already one of the better removal spells in the format, being able to do this twice for 2 mana is pretty strong, wiping out 2 of the biggest threats while holding up mana for follow-up interaction or protection spells that could be cast to try to save them. Hard to argue against the card being an auto-include in any control shell, or just any shell using white mana to begin with. 3 Steps Ahead and No More Lies are the counterspells in the deck, with No More Lies being an Azorius Mana Leak on crack, using 2 mana to counter a spell unless his controller pays 3 additional mana, exiling it if they cannot or choose not to. Here, especially for the early game, the exile clause on No More Lies does way more work than people give it credit for, especially when graveyard strategies like the Sultai Reanimator deck exist in the format. Although No More Lies is one of the more underwhelming spells to copy with a Cursed Recording, counter target spell unless its controller pays 6 is essentially a hard counterspell for a large majority of the game. Speaking of hard counterspells, 3 Steps Ahead is a spree card from OTJ with multiple modes to choose from, the main one being its cancel impression for 3 total mana, but oftentimes also being a solid way to draw 2 cards and discard a card if you choose to pay 3 at instant speed, only requiring 1 blue mana here. The third mode of 3 Steps Ahead isn't the most popular, but 4 mana allows you to create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature you control. This often underused mode is a lot more appealing in Chris's list, as you may have noticed that Cursed Recording is not a legendary artifact. That means that, yeah, we can use our 3 Steps Ahead to copy the recording, twice if we use it to copy the spell itself. Stacking the duplication effect doesn't work in a quote-unquote storm way, but being able to untap with 3 Cursed Recordings means that you'll get 4 copies of the spell that you cast, which for a Lightning Helix is 12 damage and a 24-point life total swing, or 16 damage, 32 life point swing from a Jeskai Revelation on top of 8 Monk tokens. Now the downside is that you can only copy the spell you've chosen spree modes for. So you can't pay 3 and counter it and then use copy to draw 2, discard 1, nor can you pay the extra mana to copy a Cursed Recording after countering a spell. But yeah, 3 Steps Ahead is far more than a counter spell in this deck. We are nearing the end of the spell list, but Day of Judgment is another one of those, yeah, this makes sense to be here, cards that should exist in most control decks using white. Paying 2 and 2 white to destroy all creatures still gets the job done in 2025 the way it did over a decade ago, and it needed to be used in this list to run against all those Ouroboros and other creature aggro strategies in the format that Fire Magic might not be able to catch. at. Day of Judgment is actually the worst spell to copy or curse recording, as destroying everything twice back to back is oftentimes redundant. But that doesn't mean that there aren't weird niche cases where the first board wipe causes a bunch of death triggers to occur and then puts a bunch of tokens back onto the battlefield, such as in the Orthoth Sacrifice or even Insidious Root style decks. That being said, there's not much else to talk about for Day of Judgment. Board wipe, good card to have. Aang's Iceberg is the last spell card in the main deck to touch upon, and it does play a bit of double duty in the list. Now at first glance, this 3 mana flash enchantment with 1 white pip in there exiles a non-land permanent until it would leave the battlefield. Looks like an Oblivion Ring with a small upside that you can cash in for later, which you Waterbend 3, sacrifice the enchantment, and if you do, you get to scry 2. And that is still the main use case for the card. Being able to remove problematic artifacts like Monument to Endurance or Simulacrum Synthesizer from the equation, as well as cards like Ouroborroid and other big threats, is good, especially at instant speed. But the other upside of Aang's Iceberg is the fact that we can use it on our own curse recording when the time counters start piling up, freezing it from going up and then resetting it when we thaw it from its ice as it re-enters with 0 counters on it. So needless to say, Chris has it covered when it comes to not taking lethal damage from their own cursed recordings. The Manabase of the deck is a lot more straightforward than you might think, as at its core, the deck is similar to the Azorius control list with splotches of red that don't necessarily need to be cast super early in the game. We max out on the number of blue and white sources we can get with 4 copies of both Meticulous Archive and Flood Farm Verge as the lone Azorius mana sources in the format. We're not so taxed on cards that the entering tap from Surveil lands costs us anything since our slow and steady control deck. In fact, the Surveil here to fix our draws is welcomed in that kind of deck. Although we don't max out on them, this is why we run a pair of Thundering Falls as well, the other blue-based Surveil land in the format. Although we don't care for some lands entering tapped, we don't want to be having our turns delayed come turn 3 to 5, where we can be pivotal times of the game for a control deck. So we mix and match our remaining enters the battlefield untapped lands to cover some of the mixed and dual cost of the deck. 4 copies of each Boros land, Sacred Foundry, and Sunbillow Verge cover the white mana we need for early game spells like Get Lost, while Sacred Foundry can turn on both sides of all of our Verges. Spire Bluff Canal and Riverpire Verge are 3 copy lands in the list, although Riverpire Verge making red before we have a mountain or island can make it a little awkward in opening hands without a shock or a surveil land. A singleton basic island and plains round out the mana base so that we can still cast some spells through potential land destruction spells that float around the format. But as you can see, despite having 26 lands in the list, the lack of Hallowed Fountain means that we don't have a ton of wiggle room for utility lands, save for, like the Surveil lands to enable our basic land types that matter for Verges. So we don't have any of the Restless Creature lands or any of the active ability lands like Agnikella or Quarry Mountain Monastery to help us get through the top cards of our library. Sideboards will be in flux with ebbs and flows in the standard metagame, especially when a new set releases. A control deck should always be on the lookout for cards it can swap between sideboard and main deck to help make its matchup spread better. But Crispy's Sideboard at Worlds will give us at minimum a starting point, if not provide the justification on its card choices you'll need to lock in the Sideboard 15 of your own. 3 copies of Beza the Bounding Spring are one of the cards that a lot of control decks have bounced between said main deck and sideboard, mainly because of how powerful it is in the aggro matchups. Although it's rare you'll be down cards against their game plan, it's possible to reap the benefits from the life gain and the fish quite easily, sometimes even getting the extra treasure if they're heavier on lands with their draw. In general, Beza is there to put shields up and give you time to lock the board down for a couple of turns so that you don't have quite as much pressure on your life total while getting past turn 4 in the game. You could potentially have Beza in games where they might go longer and grindier, where you think you need an additional win condition or a little extra card advantage, but the deck in general has a lot of ways it can win, especially when recording is safely online. So Beza is mostly used as a defensive tool, although it has offensive applications as well. Other sideboard threats include the final copy of Overlord of the Mistmoors, which is chilling in the case we want to have the full playset in the deck. It's handy to have this singleton copy here be able to replace place the Namesake Card Curse Recording in the case that we get into head-to-head with one of those Naya colors in the deck, as all 3 of those colors have ways to deal with artifacts in most main deck or sideboard configurations. Granted, they can deal with enchantments as well, but putting down the double flying tokens and having them blow up an Overlord over our recording is something that isn't that awful. Now, Overlord is repeatable value once it's hard cast or off of impending, so decks in the Dimir colors that have a hard time dealing with one on the battlefield would be other places that you want to stick this card in from the sideboard. Oh, speaking of that curse recording, we have an extra copy in the sideboard. Turns out, since the deck was built around the card, there might be some cases where you want more than one. You could try to brute force the recording in matches where they bring in removal for our namesake card and then slam them with another, but I honestly think this is more so for the decks that can't really deal with it once it's resolved in a clean fashion. Bringing it against control mirrors puts them in an awkward spot since you have only one to begin with. So do they really bring in cards just to deal with it once it's resolved? Especially in closed deckless events, chances are that they rip a counterspell and then feel safe while you have a second one from the sideboard is quite high. So think about bringing it in these spots instead of as a backup copy. Again, Dimir decks have a hard time dealing with a resolved artifact on the battlefield, so that could be another place you look to bring this in if you don't want to bring in things like that other Overlord. Another card that's sure to be good against control, as well as some of the Is-It shells popping up in the format, is a newer avatar card, the Unagi of Kyoshi Island. This 5/5 flash for 5 mana already has the stats to back up its mana cost, since you can play it on your opponent's end step or like as an ambush Viper surprise blocker, but comes with a few more effects that make it definitely worth running. Ward is a particularly good one, as it's a way to protect the 5/5 from targeted removal, although don't let the Ward 4 make you think it's a Kappa Cannoneer levels of unkillable. Its Ward 4 cost is actually Waterbending 4, so opponents are able to tap creatures and artifacts in order to pay for the Ward cost in addition to their lands. This means the card is a lot more effective against lower creature count decks, more so than ones with some to spare or ones that will get played for pre-combat effects. It means that the card is a lot worse off against the Azorius and Jeskai artifact decks floating around the format. They can just tap like their Cryogen relics and Clayfire bricks and whatever small artifacts they have to help turn Unagi into Unagi Dawn. However, in the right head-to-head matchups, this flash threat can also provide you with straight-up card advantage, as it has the static effect of whenever your opponent draws their second card for a turn, you also draw 2 cards. Quite the way to restock your own hand, as your opponent needs to decide if they spend the rest of their mana denying you the 5/5 and do double card draw, or trying to cast the spells they're digging for. Good enough to earn 2 slots for the eel in the sideboard. So the deck has a surprising amount of alternate win cons to pivot into, which does make some sense since the main deck has most of the best spells already included, since our curse recording wants us to, cast spells. But we do have some spells in the sideboard, mostly removal and specific counter magic. Elspeth's Smite came back in Foundations to give control decks their 1 mana removal spell against low curve aggressive decks, especially now they don't have to worry about Screaming Nemesis smacking it back in their faces. Well positioned against the mono red and some of the Simic lists that want to turn small things sideways, a pair of Elspeth Smites could easily be bumped up to more if you have a lot of aggro in your area. Negate also snags 2 spots in the sideboard as the de facto quote-unquote control matchup catch-all, as the card can hit pretty much everything except for Overlord, Beza, and any Unagi or dragons in those decks might be throwing at you. Now, most importantly, at 2 mana, it can be the counterspell that you play to counter your opponent's counterspell, just to make the stack nice and tidy. It's also fairly well positioned against those artifact-based decks, as you can hit Simulacrum Synthesizer or Repurposing Bay to slow their engines down, as well as the Boros versions of the aggro decks and some of the Is-It Prowess shells that are a lot more spell-based than creature-based to deny some critical burn damage or token generation. And yeah, Negate also counters basically every single lesson in the game. 2 different types of hate cards finish off the sideboard from Chris's Worlds list, starting with 2 copies of Rest in Peace. We already did the deck tech on Sultai Reanimator, aka Standard Living End, which is the numero uno target for these 2 mana enchantments. The Is It Lessons deck also has some weaknesses in awkward hands if we're able to turn off their grand value early, keeping them off the lessons in graveyard required to put 3 cards into their hand, or have the damage needed to kill you with their own large threats. Now, 2 copies of Torpor Orb are also good into the Reanimator deck, as it can shut off all of the ETB triggers that deck is trying to spew onto the battlefield, specifically the Bringer of the Last Gift Living End trigger. It also completely screws over both Terror of the Peaks and Craterhoof Behemoth, as those decks different win conditions. It, however, does not deal with Superior Spider-Man entering as a copy of something, nor does it shut off Arden the Usurper, making you 5/5 keyword soup demons every turn. Torpor Orb has other uses, like shutting off ETB draw effects, but can't quite stop Job Select since it only works on creatures. Likewise, Torpor Orb won't stop your Overlords from creating their tokens on entering if you cast them with Impending, since they aren't creatures, but it will if you hardcast them. Careful of putting in Torpor Orb if your opponent is running Quantum Riddler or other warp creatures too, since that'll stop the warp trigger, so you'll give them a 2-mana Riddler or 3-mana Nova Hellkite. Whoops! Now, changes in the sideboard will be entirely metagame dependent, and since we're playing a control deck, it'll be a good idea to have some of these cards on hand just to swap out just in case you run into some different decks in an RCQ or a local event. Other forms of counter magic, Disdainful Stroke, Essence Scatter, Flash Freeze, and others will be good to have on hand in case you encounter a metagame that you play with heavy creatures, larger mana threats, whatever those cards are specifically targeting. We could also see Spell Snare getting reprinted in Lorwyn Eclipse, if rumors are to be believed, which could come in to fight a plethora of 2-mana spells in the format right now. Likewise, a suit of extra removal could be something to look at, whether it be targeted or board-wide. Additional Elspeth Smites, Get Lost, or even maybe Torch the Tower could be looked at as low mana options against the aggro shells, despite some low early red mana counts in our mana base, while Pinnacle Starcage or Split Up could be additional board wipes that keep your creatures relatively unscathed. Now, adjusting spells like this in slots of some of your extra sideboard threats could be one way to shore up harder to deal with matchups over trying to pivot the way you win the game. But be sure to only remove the card you think aren't being fully utilized against the decks you continue to face. Crafting your sideboard is going to be a powerful muscle to flex when playing a deck like this, as having the right answers or right threats for the field could win you games all on their own merit. Now, control decks like this aren't going to have a typical quote-unquote nut draw that allows them to completely take over or win the game on the spot in the first few turns with their hand. Instead, decks like this are looking at the right spells to answer the presented threat in a timely manner. Starting off with the right colors of mana, mostly with the Surveil land on turn 1, followed by an untapped second land, like a Verge, to have access to all combinations of your Jeskai mana is going to be the perfect way to kick off a game. You're able to hold up Lightning Helix, No More Lies, or Get Lost for whatever your opponent has prepared. Now, if you make it to turn 3 without them playing anything, you have the choice of playing another Surveil land to fix your draws, or a third untapped mana to hold up 3 steps ahead, or even just rip a stock up if they aren't representing counter magic. Turn 4, you ideally have an Overlord to present blockers or anything that they've played, a Day of Judgment to deal with larger board threats if they've thrown down a lot after your stock up, or a Consult the Star chart so you can kick it if you decide they are not yet a threat to you. From there, you should be able to wrestle control of the game, making sure to play your tapped or untapped lands according to the responses you have in your hand. Being able to play a Cursed Recording with Interaction up and then untap for a Jeskai Revelations could just be GG by as early as turn 8. Obviously, games won't always be as scripted as what I described, and even then I gave some different options depending on what could happen. But one thing to keep in mind with a deck like this is to always be hitting your land drops. Even if you have to toss something into play tapped, you want to consistently be on par or ahead in mana with your opponent so that you can win the war on the stack and come out ahead in cards, ahead in mana to really shut them down from clawing back into the game. Making sure you keep lands on top of Surveils when you have none in hand is a place to start, unless you are in dire straits and searching for an answer card to something you absolutely have to deal with right there, right now. Likewise, trying to find the scenario that deals with threats as cleanly and efficiently as possible to keep cards in hand over your opponent will be something to learn in order to turn the corner with this style of deck. Knowing when to take a bit of damage to bait someone into a board wipe, or knowing when to pass with mana up and spend it all accordingly versus passing for the sake of bluffing when you have something like a stock up in hand and potentially the wrong interaction will help you shore up wins in these games as well. At the end of the day, the deck can be a little less punishing if you're able to keep your cursed recording around for double spellcasts of a game, altering spells like Jeskai Revelation, or doubling Lightning Helix to play clear board and make up for any lost life totals you may have incurred. Although you will have to be careful about your own cursed recordings as you interact with your opponent. You don't want to be caught at 5 counters, respond to them, and then not be able to deal with the recording via Aang's Iceberg or something else because they interact with you and responding would smack you in the face for 20. Since Chris played at Worlds, we have the data from the event to see how he performed against different decks. However, we don't really have much else to go off of, since this deck is a bit of a brew and plays much differently than the other Jeskai control decks out there. In fact, the 4-color control shells with either Team or Songcrafter or the Mystical Teaching decks are probably better comparisons to this deck than the Shiko Jeskai lists. However, Chris himself put up a really strong showing at Worlds with this deck, piloting it to a 6-2 record in the standard portion overall. Chris ended up 1-1 against the breakout Is It Lessons deck at the event, while he simultaneously beat the larger Is It Looting shell in the single match played. Chris also took down both of the combo-oriented decks in Bant Airbending and Teamer Otters 1-0, adding a victory against another combo-esque shell in that Sultai Reanimator deck. The other win in his tournament run was against the unique Golgari Dragons deck from Ben Stark, which was very close to a straight-up Golgari control deck. The second loss, however, was picked up against the Simic Ouroboros deck, which may have had too many threats too quickly for the Jeskai deck to deal with. In general, these more dedicated control shells are going to be better against combo and grindy decks, showing that in the way that Chris was able to deal with basically every combo deck in his path at Worlds. Traditional mid-range decks like Golgari are also decent matches for the deck, while non-blue control shells such as Golgari Dragon's deck would also be something that this Jeskai deck would want to sit down across from. Difficult matches for the deck will be the same as most hard control decks, anything that can get it to 0 life faster than it can deal with. We saw Simic Ouroboros be a loss at Worlds, although I think that could be swayed a little bit more towards Jeskai's side with a few more board wipe type cards in the sideboard. Maybe not enough to really make it favorable for Jeskai though. Likewise, while Chris did not play against it at Worlds, Mono Red aggro has historically been a pain for decks like this, even though Lightning Heals could make it a lot less painful overall now that Screaming Nemesis is eliminated from the format. In the head-to-head control mirrors, expect more difficulty in the sideboard games, as they will most likely have more of a spell package to swap in than what Chris was running at Worlds and what he has for their deck. Although Chris's main deck has more spells in there, thanks to them wanting to play cards that work with Shiko, where we don't necessarily need to do that and can have more Countermagic and can have things like Jeskai Revelation in our deck. But games 2 and 3 are really going to depend on sideboard choices, as well as, of course, in control mirrors, the clock. So make sure you're winning game number 1, and if you are not, tap out early and try to configure your sideboard to make sure if control is prevalent in your area, you have the right interaction and counter magic to deal with what they're doing. Chris Patello's Jeskai recording control list was one of the different takes on the cursed recording decks that we've seen floating around online, and it was kind of marrying that with what the other control lists in the format were doing well enough to kind of keep a bunch of the metagame decks at bay, and was piloted to great success overall. A 6-2 record at Worlds is outstanding, and even though Chris's limited performance was pretty decent and above average, he did only wind up finishing in 18th place, so did not see it rocking the top 8 tables, unfortunately. However, the Jeskai recording list has a bunch of cards that could swap in and out. As we mentioned earlier, sideboards are a big thing that change every single time a new set comes out, and there's one of those seemingly every other month now. So I want you to let me know in the comments down below, are you excited for this type of brew? Are there cards that you would change from the list, or is there something that you would take a control deck in a completely different direction with? While you're down there, make sure to thumbs up the video so I know that you guys keep enjoying all these different types of deck techs. After all, this request came right from you, the viewers. So if there's anything else you want to see, let me know in the comments down below, and like the video so I know to, just keep making deck techs like this. And if you appreciate the video so much that you would like to help support me monetarily, you can click the join button down below the video or on my YouTube channel's homepage to become one of my members who financially support this and all of the videos on my channel with their amazing membership. membership. Now, members, of course, do get really good membership benefits, such as early access to videos, members-only posts and content, and, of course, coveted Discord access, so we can chat up all the different kinds of competitions we're going to, the decks that we're trying out, and you can get direct one-on-one advice from me there on your list. So if that is something that entices you, like I said, the join button is down below or on my channel's homepage. You can click it and join to show your devotion. Now, as always, you can just tap that subscribe button. It's cheap, it's free, and helps you stay up to date on all sorts of metagame analysis, deck techs, and just in general, Magic the Gathering content from me. See you in the next video.